Saudi Arabia, and this will be hard for you to believe, but I remember the time when in Saudi Arabia, the entire country would shut down in summer. So there'd be really nothing happening. So starting in particular if Ramadan were in summer, or right before or right after summer, the summer would become very, very long and completely inactive. Because that was the sort of economy that ran on its oil reserves and oil revenues. And it was sort of irrelevant whether anything else worked as long as the oil sector was working. And the amount of wealth was such that, you know, people could just take massive holidays. And what emerged as a side product of COVID-19 is that that whole mindset has been completely transformed in a place like Saudi Arabia. And I'm sure all of you have heard about Prince Mohammed bin Salman, famous or infamous for various reasons, and his radical transformative vision for Saudi Arabia. So one of the questions that posed themselves at the onset of the pandemic was whether they were going to survive it, because there was this double whammy of a collapse in oil prices, a historic collapse in oil prices, and a very weak growth rate for 3 years coming onto the pandemic. So the country went into the pandemic with 3 lackluster years of growth, and then faced a massive collapse in the price of oil in addition to the pandemic. So they got this triple whammy of lackluster growth, a complete halt to economic activity domestically because of everything else everyone has experienced on the back of the pandemic, and a decline in the main source of revenue. And so one of the really interesting things we observed over the course of the lockdowns is that extremely senior policymakers, ministers, etc., didn't at all shut down and go home this time around. They were working doubly hard, and the announcements that have to do with the progression of this economic diversification program that's called the Vision 2030, enunciated when Prince Mohammed bin Salman became crown prince. The momentum around that and the pace of it actually picked up. And, you know, I found that very interesting, because in the least I expected a slowdown, and honestly, I wouldn't have been surprised that everyone just shut down and gone home. But they didn't. They were doubly active, continued to work really hard, etc. And I found that very interesting. Now, in addition to that, in Saudi Arabia and in other parts of the Gulf, such as in the UAE, what we found is that the pandemic pushed the envelope in terms of what one could do. So, for example, previously, there were certain means of communication that were very hard to use in the UAE. Certain types of free calling you couldn't use, so certain areas of social media you couldn't use, which were opened up quite significantly during the pandemic, because people needed to communicate in all possible ways, and because e-commerce entered into these domains. And so we saw a forced opening up of sectors that used to be sort of closed by the government and somewhat taboo. And we saw an acceleration in the creation of new enterprises, mostly in e-commerce and in fintech and what have you, in order to respond to the delivery of goods and services with no contact, so to continue to develop a type of contactless economy. And that was interesting as well, because these were areas that, you know, were evolving before the pandemic, but weren't evolving as rapidly. And the third area that I think was really interesting, that you know, is a direct impact of COVID-19, is that for the first time ever, the Arab countries trusted China with anything medical. So until extremely recently, there was no medical transfer of technology or know-how between China and the Arab world, because in the Arab world, the reliance was mostly on American and European science, and Chinese science, goods, services, other than in oil and gas and building roads and bridges, weren't really trusted. And so what is really interesting is that some of the leaders of the Arab world took the Chinese vaccines for COVID-19 very early on. Some of them in Dubai, back in October, November, Sheikh Mohammed himself, etc., in order to demonstrate that the vaccines were important and good to have, but also they weren't shy to go ahead and underscore that this technology was Chinese and that they were taking it. So there were quite a few surprises that came out of the pandemic that one didn't expect. Obviously, there were also some of the ordinary impacts of the pandemic in terms of economic slowdown and the rise in unemployment, the slowdown in investment, both capex and opex in some instances, that the rest of the world experienced as well.